for inviting me to be here. I'm really glad to be speaking. I've already had a really wonderful time getting to know some of the grad students here and talk to a few of the professors, and it's been really great. You're wonderful hosts, and I appreciate it. I don't know why I was chosen, but I'm very glad that I was. I'm grateful. I like to start out talking about science fiction with the following slide, which I'll put up in a second. But I also want to say before I get started that I'd really like for this to be a little bit more of a discussion than a monologue. So please feel free to raise your hand and interrupt with questions. You don't have to wait until the very end. I'm happy to answer them, or if you feel like you need clarification, etc. I'll try to resist going down rabbit holes with you so that we can get to the end. But anyway, I think the first question that we want to ask is a little bit about what we actually think speculative fiction is and why I'm not using the term science fiction. And let's go to Kurt Vonnegut for that. I'll let you read. I like to joke that I don't like to intimidate people. I like to talk to people on their level, and being a foreign service officer and having all these titles and things would be a little bit intimidating. So I like to be called a science fiction writer, so that, you know, when someone says, "What do you do?" and I say, "Oh, I wrote a novel," and they say, "What kind of novel?" I say, "Oh, like a science fiction novel," then they have contempt for me. And that really helps to, you know, get rid of any sense that they might have of, you know, my being somehow intimidating. So what is speculative fiction not? I'm not sure of that grammar. But anyway, so there's this idea, I think, in the popular sensibility that science fiction especially predicts the future. It's all about kind of discovering what technologies we're going to have, right? What's life going to be like on planet Earth in 2050 and 2150, et cetera. And this leads to a lot of really silly discussions, actually, right? Like Isaac Asimov forgot to invent the internet in the Foundation series, right? Did William Gibson correctly, you know, invent cyberspace? Does it jibe with what we have today? Did George Orwell properly predict November's presidential elections, et cetera, you know, in 1984, that kind of thing. And I think that these discussions kind of misinterpret what speculative fiction really is. So it's certainly not a way of predicting what science will be in the future. And if it's not that, then I think we could ask sort of what is this thing? I like to go back to the source, and my source for the inventor, let's say, of what we call science fiction, what I'm calling speculative fiction, for me is Mary Shelley. Now, this is a question that's very open to debate, of course, who invented X, and genres aren't really invented like this. But I'm going to say that the first speculative fiction novel is Frankenstein, right? The full title of which is Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. And in the very first paragraph in the preface of Frankenstein, Mary Shelley, 18 years old at the time when she wrote this book, don't feel bad, you know. Like if you publish your first novel at 46. Don't feel like you're a failure. You know, she says, and I'll just read the quote because I think it's really important. We're going to return to this actually several times. The event on which the interest of the story depends, we all know what this event is in Frankenstein, right? Was recommended by the novelty of the situations which it develops, and however impossible as a physical fact, affords a point of view to the imagination for the delineating of human passions, more comprehensive and commanding than any which the ordinary relations of existing events can yield. For anyone who's read Frankenstein, it gets more complicated and fussy in its language than it is here. I mean, it's quite difficult, right, to read 18th century and early 19th century prose. But we'll kind of break this down a little bit. Because here it is. What gives speculative fiction its power? She calls it the event on which the interest of the story depends, but I think we could call it a difference. And that is a difference from our mundane world as it is. It could be scientific. It could be a technological difference. It could be a difference in past historical events. It can be a difference in gender roles, say the number of genders, right? That has been done by Ursula K. Le Guin, for example, quite well in her books. Human governance, like in 1984, or something else. And this really comes to why I think that science fiction is such a terrible descriptor. So first of all, even if it wasn't speculative fiction, a lot of science fiction novels are not actually focused on science. What they're focused on is technology. And technology and science, while related, are two very different things. Remember that science is a pretty recent modern invention. You know, this method for going about scientific examination of the world is just a few hundred years old with some antecedents before that, but the structure of it that we're using today is pretty recent. But technology goes all the way back to the first time a human being picked up a rock and decided to use that as a tool, right? That's already technology. So technology is probably about as old as what we think of as being human, right? And I think that there's actually some argument for the idea that humankind is fundamentally a technological animal, right? The human being is an animal that uses technology, and that's really what makes it human in many ways. But anyway, I think what happens is that the term science fiction really becomes an impediment to understanding what it is that science fiction does. So what is it? It's more than just identifying a kind of difference or having an idea, right? Which is, I call it predication, right? We predicate a world on some kind of difference rather than prediction, right? It's that little A makes all the difference. And that's what I like about that term, predication, right? Is that that little difference that really changes everything. And that's what is, you know, the thing that recommends the novelty of the situations with which it develops. Meaning the predication allows us to go into and explore some really neat things that we wouldn't be able to explore otherwise, right? And you can think of a lot of ways in which you have speculative fiction that is entirely non-scientific. For example, The Man in the High Castle, right? Here's a piece of speculative fiction that speculates on what would happen if Germany and Japan won World War II and not the United States and the Allies, right? Mostly the Russians doing the dying. And then it affords a point of view to the imagination for the delineating of human passions, more comprehensive and commanding than any which the ordinary relations of existing events can yield. Think about, for example, the Odyssey, right? Which I like to think of in some ways as an early work of kind of proto-speculative fiction, right? It's clearly whoever the author is, right? Homer is kind of probably multiple people building up a story over a lot of time. Whoever the author is kind of speculating on like this, what if one of the, you know, people in the Iliad didn't get home and instead spent all this time going from island to island trying to return? What might that look like? You know, who might he run into along the way? And it's kind of this invention, but we can apply it to a particular instance. The idea of predication, we can apply it to, because I'm biased. The Mountain and the Sea, which was lucky enough to have 3 fantastic covers. Actually, the hardback cover in the US, the hardback and paperback cover in the UK, and then this paperback cover in the US. You can choose any which one is your favorite, but I kind of love them all, quite honestly. So this book is a combination of the real world and a predication. And before we talk about the predication, let's talk a little bit about some of the things that are very real. The book is set on the Condal archipelago, and Condal is a real place. You may have heard of it, maybe, yes. So if you had ever heard of it, it would be because Brangelina decided to vacation there what would be the proper pronoun for Brangelina? Its children, right? So they decided it. I don't know. So that concatenation of fame decided to spend a vacation there, which is, I think, the only time anyone outside had heard of Condal, except that you have, because it's where the tiger cages were also in Vietnam. So when during the Vietnam War, Condal was infamous as the prison where the South Vietnamese government and the Americans kept political prisoners from the North. And it had been a prison actually under the French system for a long time before that. But it's also this place, a very beautiful marine protected area and land. It's a national park protecting both the marine and land area of the archipelago. It's mostly a national park, unfortunately, on paper, because a lot of fishing goes on in Condal, and a lot of exploitation, a lot of poaching. That's me dreaming up the mountain and the sea there on Condal's beautiful beaches. I got to spend a lot of time here because I got to work on this project. These are local youth that we trained to photograph wildlife in the national park, but specifically insects, frogs, and small, commonly overlooked species, and then upload those pictures to a website where American scientists could help identify the species and create a kind of biodiversity map. And it was a great project. While we were doing it, we decided to teach them to scuba dive. You can see that they're all on this boat, actually about to go scuba diving. And there's a couple of their instructors in the background. The only problem with teaching them to scuba dive was that all of these kids who grew up on this tiny island could not swim. Not a single one of them. So we ended up having to teach them to swim and then snorkel and then scuba dive. And I think that the most rewarding part was just seeing them then interact with their environment in a way that they had never done before. So there's this element of the real place of Condal, and in the book, I should say that, you know, at any moment when I was writing this book, I was on the island for long enough that I could turn my head and see what would be there on the page. And so you could actually navigate around the island if you really wanted to, following the book. And then there's also this, which appears in the book as well in one of the subplots, that is the real world of fishing vessel slavery, which I don't have to tell you about because I'm sure that all the fisheries students are pretty knowledgeable about this global issue. Maybe tens of thousands of people are enslaved aboard fishing vessels, a lot of which are actually providing our fish to US markets too, through a series of shell companies. And a lot of them are registered in Indonesia, but they're also registered elsewhere. A lot of them feed into Chinese-owned companies that then feed back into US-owned companies, et cetera. So this is a huge global problem. And I mean, a good reminder that we don't like to use the word slavery. We use the words human trafficking instead. But if you took away the word human trafficking and you replaced it with the word slavery, there's probably more slaves on planet Earth right now than there have been in history. This is an enormous global problem, and this is just a part of it. So there is a part of the book where there's an AI captained fishing vessel populated by human slaves, and it's everyone says it's the most terrifying part of the book. I usually tell them it's also the most close to reality, and that the only thing that is really science fiction is the AI captain, right? It's just the replacement of a human being with an AI, but it doesn't replace much about the shape of the exploitation, and so it's very much ripped from the headlines. But so in speculative fiction, you could just write a book about the Condal Archipelago and what it's like. You could write a nonfiction book about the national park and the struggles to protect it, and you know, you could do that, and I think you could probably get a good book out of it. You could certainly, and people have, write a good book or film a good documentary about slavery in the fishing industry. But that's not what speculative fiction does. Speculative fiction kind of does this other thing, right? We're taking real concerns and we're combining it with this thing that is different, right? This thing that makes it maybe more compelling for a reader. Maybe it reaches an audience that wouldn't normally be interested in this. Come full circle to Mary Shelley, right? Because she says it right here. We combine it with that real thing because it affords a point of view to the imagination for the delineating of human passions more comprehensive and commanding than any which the ordinary relations of existing events can yield. What Mary Shelley's saying here, right, is that bringing someone back from the dead, right, piecing these human body parts together and then creating life in Frankenstein allows her to talk about all of these issues, about what it would be like to do that, et cetera, et cetera. It's not just a story about a scientist struggling. It's a story about someone who creates another human being. It's a story about responsibility for your creation. It's a story about God and humankind. And there's all these angles that you really couldn't have if it wasn't for this speculative element. And so I was also looking for a speculative element for The Mountain and the Sea. And what I came up with was the idea that I would have an octopus species that had learned to communicate with symbols, right? I thought it would be really interesting to have a first contact. We'll kind of get into some of the first contact things in a minute. Story that took place on Earth and not with an alien species, but something that really tried to kind of look at species on Earth and think about, like, well, who might become the next symbolic communicator, right? Because the idea of, like, a lot of people will ask me the question, like, so what made you want to create a sentient octopus in your novel? To which my reply is, I don't need to create sentient octopuses, right? That's not speculative fiction. Sentient octopuses are called octopuses, right? Sentience is clearly very widespread in the animal kingdom. It might have levels, right? But certainly the octopus is a being that is aware of being a self and is curious and engaged with the world and makes choices and all of the things that we think of as sentience. But symbolic communication for me is especially interesting because it allows us to do things that other animals cannot do, right? It allows for things, for example, like telling the story of Odysseus, right? Or the Iliad, passing things down from one generation to another, writing them down, communicating more and more information, building up systems that would be difficult to build up without language, such as we have it. And I say such as we have it because animals also have languages, right? They speak, they communicate. And I don't need to go too much, I think, into sentience and language with you, because as scientists, I feel like you're probably aware of these things. But like two examples I'd like to give, there was this kind of 20th century scientific idea, I should say scientist kind of idea, right? Because I don't think there was anything truly scientific about it, that animals were fundamentally like robots, right? Machines that kind of live, but their living is not like human living, right? They just function through pure instinct. They're kind of programmed. There was that kind of idea. And the simple question, or the proof that I say is, like, first of all, human beings have a pretty sophisticated theory of mind, right? We can recognize mind, I think, in others, and we feel it. And no one would let some creepy little robot live in their house, right? But a lot of us have dogs and cats and keep other animals as pets. We form emotional relationships with them that we certainly would not form with some creepy puppet automaton, right? That was just walking around on the floor. Like, that's scary, right? And then, do animals communicate? Anyone who owns a pet understands very well that animals are sophisticated communicators who have language and can get across all kinds of things and even form a pigeon so that you can understand them, right? They can come up with signals to give you to get you to do certain things, control their human, right? And you have all kinds of interactions that are communicative interactions with them. So they're not missing any of those things. They're not missing consciousness. They're not missing sentience. They're not missing language, but they're missing symbolic language. And so I use, I thought it would be fun, and it's also a fun scientific trope. It's the trope of first contact, right, with an alien species. I did not do that. That's really cool. I just found it on the internet. It's awesome. Um, and these are all first contact tropes. And I openly admit, transparently, that a large part of the Mountain in the Sea was, in fact, inspired by the movie Arrival, which, if you have not seen, I highly recommend, or the Ted Chiang story that it was inspired by. Um, I thought that communication was done too sort of glibly, usually with first contact. I've had a lot of experience overseas, and I think it's really interesting that people think we could communicate with other species when we can't communicate with our own very well, right? Like, I mean, half the time we can't communicate with our own families, much less people from other countries or other social contexts, et cetera. So I always think it's really interesting when people, like, after 3 or 4 days, are like best buds with an alien, right? And I also thought that even Arrival, for me, was a little bit unsatisfying in the sense of, like, I really want to see the struggle, right, to understand where something is coming from. Because, man, we've spent how many decades trying to figure out what dolphins are saying, right? Or whales, or all these other animals, and we're not very good at it. And it's not that we don't have lots of really smart people working on it. It's that it's fundamentally hard. And so the Mountain in the Sea is kind of about that too, like about how this first contact would be fundamentally just a lot harder than you think it was going to be, right? An octopus is not going to just come up and be like, oh, hello, flash hello on its skin, and you're going to figure out what that symbol means, and then work out on, like, a clipboard all the other, like, octopus language in, I don't know, months. Is it months in Arrival? Something like that, right? It's highly unlikely. But that opens up this door. So all of a sudden we have another species that can communicate symbolically. And for me, what's important is, what does this enable us to talk about? Well, in the book, it enables us to talk about how hard it is to communicate, both within our own species and then between species. Unless you're a dog telling your owner that you need to pee. And then it seems to be pretty easy, but they've been around us for, what, 40,000 years or so, right? So they've got a lot of practice in telling us they need to pee. And then we can talk about the embodied nature of meaning, right? This is something that I think is particularly interesting. Like, how would an octopus view the world, right? Especially in the English language. It's not quite as true in all human languages, but the English language uses a lot of metaphorical verbs called phrasal verbs, right? So you say, like, I'm going to go pick him up. Why don't you put that behind you? Let's get ahead of this. So when you think about, these are all physical metaphors that are involved in using our body, right? They're not, and then we take that metaphor, we turn it into a verb, and we use it symbolically to express something else. That's pretty extraordinarily odd. And I know it's extraordinarily odd because trying to teach anyone who isn't a native English speaker about phrasal verbs, like, makes them furious. Like, why don't you just use a regular verb? Like, you have a verb for that. We're like, yeah, but we don't really use it. Like, like, how would you say pick someone up, right? Can you think of it right away off the tip of your tongue? There's a verb for it. No? Yeah, see? We're totally reliant on all of these physical metaphors. So what would an octopus's physical metaphors be, right? How would it see the world? It's going to be a completely different thing. We can talk about human consciousness and a little bit about how that might not be completely unique, even in the animal kingdom. Corporate greed, again, the AI fishing boat, slavery, climate change, and overexploitation of Earth's resources, setting it on this kind of endangered archipelago, and all of the interest that would arise from another sentient and communicative symbolic species. The overexploitation of our resources, the human capacity for violence, and our capacity for empathy. Because in the end, spoiler alert, some communication will occur, right? Some exchange will happen, but it's not going to be easy. So why not write a piece of nonfiction? For me, I'm not super interested in answering questions, nor do I think it's, like, really within my capacity to, but I do want to build this architecture. And you can build that out of, like, the mundane, these, like, interesting sort of what if questions. you alter the world, and that kind of casts a light on our world, right? We can think of a lot of probably instances of speculative fiction that are like that, where you have this alteration that allows us to see how strange something is, right? Noughts and Crosses. Did anyone see that TV series? It's a really good TV series where Africa colonizes England, and all of the like white people of the English islands are the like the underclass, right? With these African rulers. And there's all these stereotypes about like why white people act this way and why they act that way, and like, oh, you know, their families are just broken because it's really great. I highly recommend it. It's unfortunately like a really good idea that isn't always really well acted, but it's very interesting. But things like that, right? Flipping things over can kind of show you something about the real world. I mean, something that the Mountain and the Sea is about is, you know, just how hard it is to talk to each other, right? It's not so easy for the characters to communicate with the octopus, but it's also not so easy for the characters to communicate with one another in the book, or to get their own ideas across to other humans. It's in fact, in some ways, just as hard, right? And that puts us in this sort of place, right? Of finishing the book, hopefully, and looking back at our own world and thinking, huh, right? Like seeing something new or different. And I sort of highlight this in red, because I'll go back to it, to ask complex questions about who we are and might become, as well as what the world is and might become. And so you remember I said like science fiction is a really bad term for this, but I think there is this kind of connection between speculative fiction and science. And I think that the key is right here. What is science? I think a good working definition, if I was going to tell someone sort of meeting them for the first time who had no understanding of what science was, and I was going to put it in a sentence or two, I would say this: like, science is a method that we employ to ask complex questions about who we are and might become, as well as what the world is, what it was, and what it might become. I think that's where the place where these things meet is. These are two sort of methods and systems for fundamentally asking complex questions about the world, right? So there we go. Different methods, different limitations, common goals. We want to examine and share the wonder of the world. We want to increase human curiosity about our universe and human knowledge of it. And, you know, here's I think where I want to turn it over to a little bit more of an open format. So, you know, in doing that, one of the things that I did in The Mountain and the Sea was I had read tons of books about, I mean, I've probably read every existing book about the octopus, for one thing, right? Like, to the point where, you know, you're like, yeah, like, I get that, or, you know, you kind of get completely saturated. You know, the point as a researcher, you get to where you open up like another book, and after like 10 pages, you're like, okay, like, I don't need to read the rest of this book because I already read 4 of these. I need like some other kind of, you know, area of research. So I kind of got to that point. But one thing that I realized was that all these books I was reading had something in common. There was a lot of philosophy of consciousness, there was a lot of science, a lot of other things. What do you think the thing that they all had in common was? And they were super hard to read. They're super hard to read. I actually said that one of the themes of The Mountain and the Sea is, I read these books so you don't have to, right? They were really difficult. But so what I did was I took these sections of these books, these ideas that they had, and I would take them and then I would reword them and sort of translate them for myself. And eventually I took those translations and I put them as epigraphs before each chapter in The Mountain and the Sea. And I was doing an interview about the book, and someone asked me, okay, so, you know, what was it like? How did you dumb down this complex, you know, science for your reader so that they could understand it? And I said, no, I didn't dumb anything down. I left it exactly as complex as it is. I just reworded it in such a way that it could be understood outside of its like narrow context, right? It wasn't about, trying to communicate to like some inferior like class of intellects, right? It was about trying to communicate to people who aren't specialized in your field, right? And how you do that. And so a lot of people have said that those quotes are actually, their favorite part of the book. And I think the reason for that is people want to engage with these deep and complex questions, but they often bounce off of jargon and other ways that we often have of speaking that just aren't communicating outside of our circle. We've had a lot of discussions today about science communication and where science and skepticism sort of are in the world, or like this kind of pseudo skepticism, I would say, and how we can better communicate. I'm certainly open to talking about that, but I'm also just would like to give you a chance to ask questions since we have about 20 minutes left or so. Yes.
Can you come back to your picture where you were showing, you were talking about slavery?
Yes. There we go.
My interpretation of that
Mm-hmm.
was that someone was saying, we need a crew, how many people, and everybody's, pick me, I need the money, pick me.
Mm-hmm. So here's the thing, and this is how fishing boat slavery usually happens, right? It usually does not mean that like someone was kidnapped, right? There used to be press ganging, right, for the British Navy and things like that, where they just come into a bar, right, and grab you and throw you on a ship, and you're in the Navy. What usually happens is, indeed, we need a crew for this fishing vessel. You raise your hand and you say, I'll go. Most of these people were looking to get on a ship, usually thinking it would be in coastal waters around their home. Then they get on the ship, their passport is taken away from them, and the ship goes halfway around the world to fish somewhere else. And they won't see their homes that they thought they were going to see a couple times a month for 5 years, 10 years. If you watch Ghost Fleets, it's a really good documentary about this. Some people are gone for 20 years. Some people simply don't return home because they lose their attachment to it. They get married somewhere else. They lose limbs that they're not compensated for, right? They become handicapped and feel ashamed of returning. So there's many things that happen. So it usually is someone volunteers to go somewhere else. And this is how human trafficking quite often works. You say, I would like to go to the United States. Well, you didn't mean I would like to go to the United States and become a prostitute, right? In a brothel somewhere. You meant I would like to immigrate to the United States. And then someone takes your passport away and tells you what you're going to do and basically enslaves you, meaning just takes away your freedom and profits from your labor, which you're uncompensated for. And that's why I think we need to get rid of the idea of human trafficking, because it's kind of like post-traumatic stress disorder, right? Which is a lot less effective at communicating, what happens to someone in war than shell shock was, right? It just sounds kind of mechanical and lacks the impact that something like slavery has.
So when I think about first contact narratives, I often think about them in terms of power, and especially the sort of exploring the fear of what if this new species is more powerful than us, more technologically advanced. And I haven't read your book, but it sounds like you've done something interesting here where that's not the case.
Yeah.
I wonder if you would be willing to talk about how that power dynamic appears in your work.
Yes, yeah. So that's not the case. The best that they can figure is that the octopus is something similar to our Stone Age, right? That they, their tool use and their societal development are not anywhere near modern day humans for whatever reason. But that's also reading from outside, right? So it's never completely apparent where exactly they might be on some kind of chart, or if charting that progress in that way even makes sense. But what is really clear is that human beings do retain the power to do a lot of damage to this species and to maybe destroy them, and to maybe destroy them before we even, understand them. And that part of that destruction is an almost inevitable result of revealing their existence at all. That's another sort of subplot in you'll see there's an organization also in the book that appears to be just trying to make sure that no one finds out that the octopus is there, right? But yeah, I mean, that power dynamic is very different here. But there's another sort of reversal of that power dynamic where the octopus is just about as indifferent to human suffering as we are to octopus suffering, right? And not really that interested in whether we live or die, in the same way that a lot of humans are not really that interested in whether an octopus lives or dies, right? So there's that too. So another kind of power dynamic, right? Other questions? Yeah.
Also talk about classification.
Yeah, so whole other can of worms. So Tusks of Extinction is a book about the de-extinction of the mammoth, but it's also a book about elephant ivory poaching and systems of animal exploitation. This comes from I worked on Condell, of course, and it was super pleasant, and that was a wonderful part of my job. I worked on the ivory trade, and that was not pleasant and not a wonderful part of my job. And I think that the root kind of moment where the Tusks of Extinction was born, if you could say this, I mean, books are complicated and they kind of come from many different directions. But while I was working on the ivory trade, I was shown this picture, and it was a picture of a Vietnamese woman standing with a rifle and a dead elephant behind her. And with this look on her face of like, not just sort of blank, like lack of comprehension about anything that was really, happening, and kind of despair, right? Like emptiness and despair. And the terrible thing about this picture was this was a picture of like a woman forced into sex work, who then someone had sent to Africa on a big game hunt to hunt an elephant and legally take back its ivory. Because at this point, the price of ivory on the black market was high enough that it actually made sense to pay the big game hunters and legally hunt elephants, but then smuggle the ivory back through the black market. So this was a trafficked person, right? Being sent to Africa to do further damage, right, to another exploited being, right? And then feed more money back into this system of trafficking in people, objects, commodities. So it was like someone whose body had been made a commodity, right, being sent to make a commodity out of someone else's body, right? And that circle is kind of what the Tusks of Extinction is about. It does have a high speculative kind of science fiction element to it, which I won't go into too much. It kind of takes place in the future, but it makes a connection between de-extinction of the mammoth and elephant ivory trade. Yeah.
So yeah, you talk about a lot of very big environmental and kind of human challenges that we face, and I imagine that reading it, like individual readers think about it, but you also have the ambition or the hope that at a higher level, like, I don't know, decision making or like that it could have an influence. And have you seen any outcomes from your books in terms of, I don't know, changing the way things are?
My favorite thing that anyone ever says about reading The Mountain and the Sea is, I will never eat octopus again. And The Mountain and the Sea won the Locus Award, was a finalist for the Nebula and a couple other awards. And I say, like, beyond like the awards and the recognition and the sales and all that, just the idea that The Mountain and the Sea may have slightly reduced the demand in octopus, right, is enough for me. some other people have said, that I'm fooling myself, and books don't make any difference, and writing about these things doesn't change anything. And I always think that's a really interesting argument. You kind of hear it a lot, like this is not activism, and you're not changing the world. Don't think that you're actually doing anything. Because when people say like writing doesn't change anything, what I think about is the protocols of the elders of Zion, right? And how many people that book killed, right? Like how many human beings died because of that book being written and published, right? By Tsarist authorities, right? And I think, yeah, writing absolutely changes the world. Books absolutely change the world for positive and negative. And I just, if words don't change anything, what do you think changes things, right? I mean, if human language doesn't institute change, what is it that institutes change in human society? So I think, that's where I kind of hope there would be something that would come out of it. But I mean, I don't fool myself into thinking that like the president of the United States or, someone else is going to, I don't talk about the president of the United States. I don't fool myself into thinking there's going to be some gigantic systemic change that's going to come. But what I think is thousands of other people are also doing things like this, and the collective, change will come over the many, 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 many books, the many scientific studies, the many, many sort of the collective mass effort that is going on right now to change the way that people think about the world. And this is just a tiny, tiny part of it, like a little drop in an ocean of effort, but that's a positive thing. So I'm happy with that. Yeah. Here. And then
you talked a lot about communication, and I recently have been reading The Dark Forest, the second book in the 3-volume series with my supervisor in lab, and we chat about it. And I was fascinated when I got to a part, sorry if there's spoilers for you here, where the other civilization communicates via thought. There's no filtering. I don't know if you were familiar with this series.
I only read the first one. Yeah.
Okay, in the second book, they touch on the civilization communicates via thoughts. There's no filtering, so there's no lying, no deceit. It's just thoughts, and so they don't trust humans because humans have the ability to speak. And writing this book, I'm thinking about communication. Did you have any aha moments, any major discoveries about human communication that you have never thought before that this book pushed you to realize?
I think that the most fundamental thing that the book really pushed me to realize is that there actually isn't anything that humans do that animals don't do in one form or another. Like a lot of people had drawn, there's this continual effort to draw a line between us and animals, which is bizarre in a way, right? Because we're clearly animals and we understand that we're animals. So why are we always trying to find this boundary between us and animals? And the lie that a lot of people had finally drawn was on lying, right? That human language allowed human beings to tell stories that weren't true. But that's not true either. That there are lots of animals that lie, even with really simple communicative systems, by making a noise that indicates a danger up above instead of down below, and then stealing things while all the other animals are looking in another direction, right? So animals also lie. So I thought that was what really was interesting for me was trying to think about what it is that makes us so different from it, because clearly we're animals, but clearly we're fantastically different from other animals, and that's why I think it really comes down to this sophisticated use of symbolic, like encoding of language, right? It's the ability to take your language out of your head, right, code it, and then transmit it to other people, whether it's through an oral tradition, right, or through a written tradition. And the written tradition is extremely powerful because then it allows you to store up massive amounts of information, which is not to denigrate oral traditions, which are clearly sufficient for sophisticated living in the world and mastering one's environment. But the written system is particularly interesting because it's just this incredible mass of knowledge that you can then just shift and move from one generation to another. And it allows people to start not at zero, but somewhere way above it. When talking about animal intelligence, I like to, give the example of, imagine that you're born an adult, you have all your adult capacities, you're born in a temperate forest, it's not too hot or too cold, so the weather is not going to kill you. You're going to live for 2 years. Most things in the forest want to eat you because you're delicious, right? You'll never meet another human being, except maybe somewhere toward the end of your life where you'll meet one to mate and then like have kids, and immediately after you give birth to your child, you'll die, right? How well do you think you would do in that situation, right? I mean, given human capacities, right? And then the question is, how smart are octopuses? Because like that's life, right? I mean, that's the life of an octopus. There you are, you drift down into wherever it is you're going to live, and bang, like race is on. Try to avoid getting eaten while trying to eat and survive. Yeah, longer answer than I intended, but yeah.
I'm curious about the idea of like clairvoyance and from positive as a female main character.
Yeah.
As well as like too. But I think about like other speculative fiction pieces that also like deal with ideas of clairvoyance and communication from a female lead. And I'm wondering like how you wrote from that, and also like, if clairvoyance and that idea like played into how you wrote it.
So when I was a kid and I was setting out to write, my mother is a very strong feminist, and at some point she said, when you write, I want you to center women in your writing, and I did, and I do, and I think it's more just like having been asked to do something by my parents, and then just being a good son, right? In some sense, like that's so the question that I ask myself when I'm sitting down to write a book is not like, can I write a female character that's realistic? Because I think it's totally bizarre that we'd end up in a world where someone is more suspicious of a science fiction writer writing the other gender or another gender than writing an octopus. Right. I mean, that's a strange place for us to be in as a species, that we feel so divided amongst one another that we just can't possibly like understand how the other person feels, and our empathy like wouldn't cross any of those gaps. It's a weird place to be, right? But that being said, I'm not trying to co-opt that experience. I just think that when I sit down and I start writing, I think, why this gender, right? Like if I'm going to write from a male perspective, it better be for a reason. And I have a reason to write from a woman's perspective in The Mountain and the Sea. And that's because all the environmentalists that I worked with in Vietnam were women. They were the ones doing this work. And if I was going to have a local scientist who was the main character in the novel, it didn't make sense to make it a man or an American, right? Or any of those things. It made sense to make that character look like the people who were actually doing those things in that place. Right. And in the Tusks of Extinction, similarly, I mean, there's just so many strong women in Russia doing that kind, who are more compelling for me to write than the men that I know from Russia. Sorry, Russian men. She's also not Russian, she's a Tatar, but like a Russian citizen, right? Is it a question? Oh, okay. You just moved, so I'm like. Anything else? We have maybe time for one. Yeah.
There's a lot of like interesting use of technology in The Mountain and the Sea.
And
some of it feels like super fantastical, like way far in our future, and some feels like kind of this could be happening now. I'm kind of curious, like what was your thought process behind a lot of the like technology?
Well, I like I like to use sort of near future technology, and I like to kind of think about, where might we be next. But I also just like cool shit. And one of the fun things about being a writer is sometimes you can just do cool things. And, like someone was like, well, I don't think it's realistic that Tibet would become this kind of global, superpower, because they were masters of AI technology. I'm like, yeah, but is it awesome? You're missing the point. Like, is it awesome? Right? Sometimes it's kind of both, right? Like some of the technology, yeah, is like me sort of extrapolating a little bit what might come next, the 0.5s, in the book and things like that, which are already, here. But some of it is just like, I would like to do this cool thing, right? And I think it would be neat, or I would like to use this in a metaphorical way, and therefore I'm going to cause it to exist, because I can do whatever I want. It's my book.
I think on that note, we can shift to the TDIT out in the lobby, and please approach Ray and.
All right.
Is
that okay?
Yeah.